Hello, everybody. I'm Michael Stahnke. I'm here to talk to you about change management and how you may or may not be falling in love with it today. While the title was How to Fall in Love with Change Management, I'm going to kind of doubt that by the end of this, you're totally in love with it, but hopefully you'll hate it a little bit less. I am the VP of Platform Engineering over at CircleCI, and so I have a very, distinct and focused view of change management, and we'll talk about that throughout this presentation. Before I was at CircleCI, I've spent time in many different technology companies, industries, sizes, doing different things. Caterpillar was 100,000 employees, and they had kind of a classic change management approach. From there, I went to Puppet, where we saw the change management growing from a small company to a larger company working in the technology vertical. They also got to work with all sorts of different customers, and you could hear the complaints and I would say the fewer praises of change management processes throughout their customer base. I've spent some time doing open source stuff, primarily with the Fedora project, and of course, now I'm at CircleCI. Through all that time, I've discovered a few universal truths. And these are the things that we'll start with to build a foundation of how we build a change management process. The first thing is change is difficult. And this is the same whether it's human change or technology change or any kind of change. Taking things from the way they are to something different takes effort. It's vital, though. We cannot make progress without it. And so we really want to dig into change and how we be successful with it. But change management sucks. And that's not data backed. That's just my take on it from experiencing change management for my entire career in the technology field. So throughout this presentation, you're going to see two different icons on most of the slides. One of them is my face, or at least a cartoon facsimile of my face, that is, me saying, this is my opinion, this is narrative, this is gathered from my experience and my skepticism. It is editorial. The other is data, which is proven with math and facts. And I just wanted to be super clear on labeling which one was which, because there's a lot of disinformation in the world, and I don't want to contribute any more to it than I have to. So back to my editorial, my first editorial hot take here is that change management sucks. So can we prove that change management sucks? That's kind of an interesting place to start from. Well, over the years, I had worked on these things called the State of DevOps reports when I was at Puppet. And even after that, when I went to CircleCI, I still wanted to continue in this space because this research is fascinating. We get to talk to a whole bunch of different individuals. We get to get their opinions. We get to run some data science on it and figure out how are people succeeding, what things are in their way, why is DevOps successful in some areas, why is it not in others. These are the things that are very interesting to me. And with this body of work, I would be foolish not to use it to figure out, is change management a thing that works or not? Does it suck or not? So this was kind of one of the themes this year of our 9th annual report. The 2020 State of DevOps report, which is available now, has a lot on change management. And so we had 2,400 plus respondents with firms of all sizes, all verticals. And you just get a survey here of what's really going on. How is change management effective or where is it ineffective? But back to my narrative. Let's just have a story, an example, a hypothetical. Let's start it in 4 parts. I have a small change to make. I make that change and it's successful. Cool. I have a small change to make. I make that change and it's successful. I do that one more time. And then we have a significant change and it goes sideways. I imagine many of you have been in a situation like this before. But here's what happens when that happens. You are at a crossroads. You're at a path. You have a couple choices to make. How do we deal with a change failure? What do we do about that? Well, most people invent something like a change management process. And I can tell you that this diagram was not nearly complicated enough to really picture the way I feel about change management and the way that I wanted change management to look on this screen. But the point is you end up with many checks and balances. And every time something's gone wrong in history, there's now a check for it, or there's a compensating control for it, or there's a step for it. And in the end, it just feels like you're not moving at the pace you wish you were. The characteristics of whatever your change process is kind of define your organization, both culturally and at the speed at which you can move. Those definitions emerge from the characteristics of your change process. Now, there's a lot on this slide, and I'm not going to read it all to you, but the things that we really looked at are, how do you approach your change management? We broke this down into basically 3 main categories, and that's approvals, which is what type of approval do you require to do change, your risk mitigation techniques, which is things like deployment or manual reviews of steps to be performed or actions. And then automation. Do you have automation for deployment? Do you have automation, that's built into more of a CI/CD type pipeline? And so as we broke down these organizations, they kind of grouped into these different things based on their level or aggressiveness in terms of approval, in terms of risk mitigation, and in terms of their automation. So we start out with operationally mature, which is kind of a group that I would say most often the change process is most focused on being operationally successful. Mean time to recovery is really important, quickly restoring service. They do some automation. They have a large degree of approvals in more of an orthodox manner. When we say orthodox approval, it generally means you have like a ticket where you sign off and hit approve, or a ticketing system. Perhaps it goes out to a change control board. The next group is engineering driven with a higher emphasis on automation. They're usually a little bit smaller than some of the operationally mature mid-market sized organizations, but they also have a high deployment rate and still maintain a rapid time to restore service, which basically means they're able to make change relatively often with a high success rate, which is really what we're looking for. The next one is governance focused, which I would say is generally your very large enterprises, places that have a lot of process, a lot of kind of external stakeholders in the change process. And those are very difficult to work with, is what I guess what I'll say. And we can prove that out later as we move forward. And the last one is ad hoc. And that's really kind of your small systems, your small companies where perhaps they've hired a few generalists to just kind of do it all. And the coordination costs are not very high. And the success and failure, costs are not that high either. And then you start to ask, well, what does a successful change management process even entail? And to us, it kind of is all about implementation success, which is kind of how often are you deploying change and what's that failure rate? How inefficient is it? And that's, do we have to wait to do changes? Do we have to get approvals? Do we have to get approvals by someone who's not going to make the change or somebody outside the team? Do we spend more time on documentation than we do on the work, as a lot of contributors would say? And then the last one is performance sentiment. And this was something that I really pushed to get into the report because I wanted to ask, how do people actually just feel about their change management process? I have had kind of an anti-affinity toward change management processes through most of my career. And I wanted to see if, am I alone? I don't think I'm alone, but is this a common thing? Is this a shared viewpoint across the industry? And so we asked a lot. Do you feel like it's worth the cost? Do you feel like it's facilitating your business? Do you feel like it's, it adds value overall? And so when we get into approvals, one of the first things you add when you create a change management process is somebody going to approve this stuff? So what if somebody had to approve my work? Okay, separation of duties or other, kind of audit type controls may, I guess, recommend that we go that direction. Well, there's two main approval models here. And one of them we called orthodox. And this broke out into having a change control board, having multiple levels of management involved, having changes that can only be made during certain types of windows. And the person requesting the change cannot be the person who implements the change. Sometimes you'll see that in highly regulated environments. Sometimes you'll see it in organizations that have long established technology divisions. And this is kind of the way they built it a long time ago and haven't changed much. And then you can see more adaptive approvals where it could be the changes are approved by the team implementing it, or there's some more post-implementation reviews to look for opportunities for improvement or, incident reviews if it goes wrong. And there's also pre-approval, which can happen, if you can demonstrate success over and over again, why are we talking about approvals anymore? Let's just go do the changes if they're going to work. One of the key takeaways from this year's State of DevOps report was that if you have orthodox approvals, you result in 9 times the inefficiency when compared to styles with fewer approvals. And so the more approvals you have throughout your entire change process, the more gates you keep, the worse your effectiveness will be overall. And a 9x, that's a pretty significant jump. Most of the time we're looking for, things in the 10% range, but this is way, way bigger. And then the other thing with approvals is once you get to a certain size, there's another sentiment that creeps in, which is what if I just don't? Like, who's going to know if I go do this change and it wasn't approved? Turns out they look at what tickets have approvals on them. What if I don't file a ticket? What if I go around this process? What if I put in all the information in the ticket, or I put in information that I know will be approved, even if that's not the things I'm actually going to be doing? There are several ways around a change management process. Ask me how I know. So when you have change management evasion, you can see that different groups practice change management evasion in different ways. I won't read this exact quote to you, but what you can find is that some groups are much more likely to practice change evasion, and I would say that's generally from the operationally mature areas, whereas the governance-focused areas almost never practice change evasion because they're settled into it. They've kind of reached the acceptance phase of this, recovery from change management. They're just in the acceptance. They know it's there. They're going to deal with it. But basically, operationally mature organizations have the highest levels of change evasion. That's not that surprising to me, because when I think about my kind of cynicism toward the change management process, I was primarily in the operations space for most of that part of my career. And, my job was to make sure things were stable and they were online. And sometimes I didn't want to go through a process where I had to wait 6 hours or 2 days or 2 weeks before I could go fix something. It might have been broken, but not broken bad enough that it was considered an outage. But sometimes you just wanted to fix it and make sure that it was going to be okay. Governance-led organizations just accept the obstacles. They're just like, yep, these are all the processes that we have, and I will follow them. They don't even look back at them or even think they're bad in most cases, from what we can tell from our data sets. Now, this is some older data, but from the 2014 State of DevOps reports, we looked into, the effectiveness of a change control board or a change advisory board, a CAB. And what we found out was that basically, if you don't have a CAB, you're going to do better. And this is my favorite takeaway from the entire thing, because if I could just get rid of CAB meetings, I think I would consider most of my career a big win. External change approval boards have a big negative impact on throughput, while a negligible impact on stability. So basically, you're going slower, but you're not doing any better. Or as a colleague of mine once said, it might not be good, but at least it's expensive. We ask about change management evasion because this is the stuff that I did. So I put these questions in there because I had hypotheses that people work around their change management process, that they don't want to be a part of it, that they're looking for a better way. Tickets and backout plans and approvals and a CAB meeting and implementation details and attachments on tickets and all that kind of stuff, they're just not my thing. That's not the way I wanted to work. And I felt like there had to be a better way to still achieve the outcomes that we were all after without basically filling in a gap of good process with paperwork. It wasn't worth it to me the way it was implemented. And I finally came up with, I think the purpose of our change control system is to make sure we don't have change. And that felt like, wow, that's not the direction any of us should be heading. What are the incentives? Why are we aligned? Where are we aligned? And so you get back to a classic case of misaligned incentives. There's a group that wants stability, and there's a group that wants velocity. I was in operations, and so I was measured on stability, but the demands from my customers were more about velocity so that they could enable new capabilities or new features out for their customer base. This looks pretty much like something else we've talked about a whole lot in this space over the years, which is just, the dev versus ops divide. And so in operations, what they really want you to practice is Newton's lesser known fourth law, which is a system at rest will remain online. If I don't touch it, I leave it in the corner, it'll probably be fine. And for most values of fine, that's probably true. But if you need to enable a new capability, well, that's touching it. If you need to upgrade it because there's a life cycle, management thing, it's getting too old, well, that's touching it. And so there's always these kind of back pressure to keep change flowing through the system, even though your idea is don't touch it. So ops is once again up against a wall where it's impossible to exceed expectations, because if the expectations are 100% stability, you cannot exceed them by definition. And then you have the development side or the application side of the house saying, hey, I can't get my work done at the pace we want because those people who want stability are always in my way. And that means that you end up with this kind of blame storming happening all toward the operations crew. And that's why people that have an operations background generally are not a huge fan of the change management process. But as I look at it, when I want to achieve good outcomes, I don't want to be a gatekeeper, even if I'm sitting in an operations role or I'm sitting in, a hybrid role between development or application and operations type teams. I want to make sure that we can get our outcomes that we want, our business outcomes. So I come back to these roads and I think, well, if we went down the road that led to lots of approvals and CAB meetings and traditional change process, I'm using tools like, Remedy or other large ticketing systems, HP Service Desk. What else is there? What are the other options available? Where does that other path even go? That change control process just wasn't worth it. My impressions of change management were basically there's big, heavy changes. There's lots of manual context or tribal knowledge that's required to make it all work. We deliver it into inconsistent environments. We have slow feedback. It's highly siloed, and we don't really want to communicate with anybody throughout the whole process. Doesn't that sound like something you really want to sign up and be a part of? What would I change to make it worth it? Well, basically, one of the questions I started with were, how does development move fast? What are their incentives? How are they aligned? Do they not have the same restrictions that I have as somebody who works at operations or SRE? Is this system changeable in any way? And when I say the system here, I mean the change management process. Do I have any influence on making it better? Can I suggest improvements or removals of complicated parts of the process that I don't feel like add any value? And then what would good change management look like? So let's go back to the data to find out more of the answers for these types of questions. If you recall, we kind of looked at approvals and risk mitigation techniques and automation as the overall inputs to whether or not, where you plotted on our organizational categorization for change management. And then also we started to look at change management effectiveness. And so when you want to know if a change control process is effective, you kind of want to look at implementation success, the performance sentiment, and the inefficiency. And again, the implementation success, is it working? Performance sentiment, do you hate it? Inefficiency, is it too slow? More or less is what we're looking at. So here's some more examples of things you would look at under performance sentiment, inefficiency, and implementation success. Again, I won't read them all to you, but they're here for reference if you'd like to see them. So from a performance sentiment standpoint, do you think this process reduces risk and provides the appropriate level of review for the work you're doing? Does it reduce the downtime that you have for your services? Does it provide useful information to other people? Like, can they plan their deployments or their changes or their activities around what work you're doing? And really, does it facilitate a change of pace that works for the business, that helps the business advance? That's really the performance sentiment. So we ask a bunch of those questions and you kind of rate on a scale of, 1 to 5, I agree or I strongly disagree with this. And we get some data out of that after we slice it and dice it and correlate it with some of the other things. And we basically find out that the people that have the highest performance sentiment are doing the highest amount of automation. Okay, that checks out. We also see they have the highest amount of automated risk mitigation, which are things like blue-green deployments or canary deployments, so that they're doing more of the testing with the technology versus the testing with somebody's reading through a document and looking over every single change and trying to figure out, well, if you type this and then that, is that going to work? Or, show me your implementation plan kind of thing. So ironically, the operationally mature area had the highest performance sentiment of all of our 4 clusters. And again, they have a decent amount of automation in operationally mature. They also have a lot of approvals. And so they're kind of in this hybrid, rather mature space, but they feel like their change control process works pretty well. Whereas when you look at the outcomes on the engineering driven, they have higher outcomes, but they're not as happy about it. And so what we tend to look at from the operationally mature companies is it's kind of one of those things where if you've invested a lot into your change management process, you feel like it should be working. And so you might feel better about it just because you've done a lot of work. And I think this might be one of those cases where let's not confuse a bunch of activity with results. And part of this is also, do not underestimate organizational inertia. Change control, from my experience, is one of the most difficult things to actually influence in an organization because a lot of times there's a body that is external to the people doing the work that own the work and are responsible for the work. And so they're resistant to change because they don't feel the pain of that process. And so the people doing that work have to lobby for that or really kind of push their points to get the change they want into the change management process. Organizational inertia is kind of another way of just saying, but that's the way we've always done it. And I feel like change control is more subjective to that statement than nearly any other part of the business. So if we break down our 4 different clusters of where you group from change management and change management effectiveness, you can see that our governance focused approach, the implementation success, well, the bar that's out there to the furthest right is a low success rate. The inefficiency is high, so a high level of inefficiency, and the performance sentiment is low. So basically, everything is terrible if you work in a governance kind of style of change management. And I would say that's probably the closest to the one that I worked at for a large portion of my career, which is probably why I'm as cynical about change management as I am. If you're operationally mature, these are more mid-market, mid-sized companies that I think are kind of maybe pushing the horizon on more automation and trying to get better for all those things, but they haven't yet achieved that. And so they end up with, a low level of implementation success, a low level or a high level of inefficiency, but somehow they feel okay about it. And that's, again, kind of this, well, if you spent a bunch of time invested in something trying to improve it, maybe you feel like it's better than it really is. It's almost like the Dunning-Kruger effect, but for change management, I guess. And then we have this engineering approach. So engineering-driven approach, you can see their implementation success is quite high relative to the other cohorts. Their inefficiency values are much lower, and their performance sentiment, however, is low. And so, I would be pretty happy with the 2 on the left. And then the right one, I look at, well, the performance sentiment just isn't that great. Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. And then you have ad hoc, which is generally those smaller companies where you have generalists that are responsible for a whole bunch of things. The coordination costs are not very high. And they actually have a very high implementation success rate, or quite high. They have a high, their inefficiency is very low because there's not a lot to be efficient with. There's not as many touch points, not as much coordination. But they also don't really like the way that anything works for their change management process. So overall with effectiveness, if we kind of graph this out and stack bar it, the highest degree of automation is going to lead you to the best outcomes in terms of high effectiveness. The lower things are going to be low success rates and lots of approvals or many different types of approvals and approval steps. Those are the biggest contributors to your overall CM effectiveness. So what would make change worth it? What would make a change management process work? Well, I would like to move as many changes as I can into a category where the scrutiny is near zero. I would like to have as many things automated as I can. I'd like to not cross team boundaries or departmental boundaries for change approval unless it's absolutely required and I feel like I could understand the value behind it. And I also want to make super common things available via self-service so that I'm not doing changes that are more like provisioning. Those are the things that I would do differently if I was really trying to build a change management process from the ground up today. So an effective change management process basically consists of small batches delivered frequently. They're quick to deploy. They're fast to remediate. They have fast feedback cycles. They have self-service components. We can measure how well it's doing. And the stakeholders are involved upfront in kind of the pre-approval process and not in the transaction of every single change going through the system. And I thought about that for a little bit. And I thought, wow, that sounds like something else that I'm pretty familiar with. And that's, why don't I just do this with a CI system? And if you notice, I combined the Mike's narrative and the data side of things because I was really happy that this is where the reveal went. It wasn't my intention when I first started writing this that the entire thing was going to be you should use CI, or at least not to CircleCI. When I say you should be using CI for your change management system, I do believe that wholeheartedly. And I do think CircleCI is a spectacular change management system and probably the one you should be using. But if you have other CI systems going on, you're probably doing way, way better than those who are not doing most of their changes through a continuous integration and continuous deployment pipeline. From 2018, we had our 5 stages of DevOps evolution. And this was a model that we built out trying to be a little bit more prescriptive about success for DevOps teams or teams trying to have DevOps success. And as I started looking at this, I thought, well, what is having CI as kind of the backbone of your technical infrastructure and your change deployment infrastructure? What does that buy us right away? Well, kind of just doing CI, I get a few of these things across different stages. And remember, progression through these stages from 2018, it's not necessarily linear. But when you're doing more and more things on the ones that are further to the right, you're generally having better outcomes and you're a little more mature in your DevOps, evolution. So there's quite a few things that I get here if I'm doing CI at a relatively basic level. And a lot of that has to do with things being in version control and possibly, kind of insourcing approvals into a local area versus having them go out across boundaries. Now, once you invest a little more in your CI system, you start to realize that you're standardizing and you're pulling in things to work the same way over and over again. And with fewer variations across your technical estate, you're going to have better outcomes because there's just fewer if statements and all the flows and all the processes and all the cognitive load that everybody has to keep. And so as you implement CI, you end up with more things available via self-service, more settings in version control, and you can have better testing before things happen and get out into a production type environment. Now, I could say all that, and you can say, yeah, I hear all that, and I believe all that, but that's really difficult. You're right. It is really difficult. And the people that tell you that CI and CD are the answers to everything, they're not wrong, but it doesn't mean that it's easy. Sometimes the best things out there aren't the easiest. And so we asked, well, why aren't you doing more with automation? Why aren't you doing more with change control automation in particular? Or why aren't you doing more with self-service? And these are the top 3 reasons that every different cohort kind of gave us. And you can see that incomplete test coverage is one of the main ones. And that's because testing in a very complete, exhaustive sort of way is very, very difficult. You can test pretty easily at a code level, like at a unit test level, but then as that code starts to interact with the next service or 3 services, how does all that test and how does that work? What does it happen? How does that work under load? How does that work with users in the middle of an upgrade? There are a lot of test scenarios that are very difficult to put together. There's also, lack of skills or regulatory constraints. The one that really, really stuck out to me, though, was this lack of trust across functional teams in the governance-focused area. So we've already talked about if you're really governance-focused, you have low success rates, you have a lot of approvals, you're not very happy with your change control process, but you don't evade it very often. And a lot of it has to do with you don't trust your functional area. You don't trust the next team over to do their work when they say they're going to do it. And that's a big problem if you're going to move toward automation, because automation is kind of, I put this thing together, I make it work, and I make it available for you to consume. And if you don't have the right trust, you're not going to be very successful with automation. And then for each of these cohorts, again, we kind of looked at, what does their success look like overall from just the classic DevOps outcomes that we've been measuring for years in these State of DevOps reports. I'm not going to read these to you again, but you can see that, operationally mature is much better at kind of the production service side. Engineering driven and high evolution is much more kind of evenly spread across the board. And governance focus is also pretty good at restoring service, but there's a lot, they move quite a bit slower in some cases. Let's talk about the impact of CI/CD on the change control process. In our survey, those who agreed that using CI was basically cost benefit positive, they had higher outcomes and they had a higher degree of effectiveness. Those who didn't agree with that statement, they actually didn't, they thought their change control process was really good, but their outcomes didn't support that. And so it may have been kind of that group that is very invested and had done a lot of work on change control process, but really isn't getting the results that they're looking for. A further look at a couple of the components in the model around risk mitigation and automation is pretty interesting to me. And part of that is because these are the things that you can put into a CI pipeline relatively easily. And you also get to bypass some of the classic kind of change control hierarchy, I guess, that I've seen in a lot of companies. And that's things like when you have automation, work going through a CI/CD system may not require a ticket because it's handled in a unit of work that is different than a ticket, perhaps a pull request or a patch request or a merge request. Also, if you can make changes to the CI or CD pipeline without a traditional change control process, but again, maybe a pull request done through code, that is a lot of times much easier to get through. And generally, the contributors enjoy working in those tool sets more so than the, I would say, larger, more traditional change process tools. One of the things that I learned through all of this, because of the way that the engineering-led approach doesn't really look at their change control process as working very well, is that cynicism is actually higher in engineering than in operations. And that to me, that was really, really surprising. I've always expected operations people to be kind of more cynical and a little bit more of the, the callback to the grumpy people in the basement. And what we found was that the engineers really work on change control. They want to move very quickly. And even when they succeed in a lot of ways, they don't think it's good enough and they're not satisfied with it, which suggests that they're more interested in the continuous improvement type of model versus we are satisfied with the way things are. So we go back to the challenges of change management. Well, if you're engineering driven, architecture is one of the things that's really hard to do. And so again, we have test coverage is problematic. Organizational mindset can sometimes be problematic, but architecture, and this doesn't mean that you need to do microservices everywhere or run everything cloud native. It might just mean that can you make changes in some areas of the system without impacting other areas of the system? Can you break them into smaller units of work? When we look at our 5 stages of DevOps evolution again, CI checks most of these boxes. And I think that's what's really important about the benefits of a CI and CD system to do the majority of your change work. It allows your changes to be done in code and not in prose. They don't end up in, lengthy tickets with long documents saying we're going to do this, and you hand it over to a production control type operator. It means that you can work within your team primarily and have your team kind of authorize and validate the work. And you can still, go through regulatory things with separation of duties where the person who's implementing the change is not the person who approved it or not the person who authored it. You can still have those separations, but they're done in, I would say, a little more agile and a little more velocity focused ways as compared to classic change control. So what would I do differently? Well, I would make sure that my changes were code and they're not tickets. The unit of work should be some type of code unit. Pull request is the one that I would think of off the top of my head. I would like to use tools that I enjoy and that engineers get to pick or that contributors get to pick. In most cases, you're never going to get an operations team or an engineering team that said, you know what, we selected to use HP Service Desk or we selected to use Remedy. That's usually done by a larger body that is probably more service management focused in an IT organization. And that just kind of happens to everybody else. And so, those tool selections happened to me. I didn't get to help make them. In my ideal world, I would be able to improve the change control process. And so if I had new ideas on how to be more efficient or more effective, there would be a way that make that work. I would automate to mitigate the risk of change. And that might mean that we know how to do this and we do it all the time. And so we have, a template for it, or we have a thing where you can just enter a couple environment variables and the job goes and runs and does the change for you, which also allows me to use less experienced individuals to do those changes, which is a side benefit we really haven't talked about too much. And the last thing is I would try and move quickly. The waiting periods and the approvals and the going through the CAB meeting, that's just disheartening for everybody who wants to make good things happen for their company. So does this actually work? Well, CircleCI would fall into the engineering driven cohort of change management processes. And this is stats that I pulled up last night out of our week ending, November 1st. We did 383 deployments of change. We had 0 incidents. Every week isn't that good, but most of our weeks are in the, we have 300 to 500 changes or 300 to 500 deployments going on and somewhere between 0 and 2 incidents. I'd like it to be somewhere between 0 and 1 or 0 and 0.5, and we will keep working on that. Again, this last week was quite a good week. So I pulled it out and put it in here. Almost all changes go through CI. I think about less than 5% of our changes are made outside of our CI system. We do a lot with Terraform for infrastructure changes and cloud level changes. There are a few things that you can't do, through our code. And a lot of it has to do with administration level tooling or, access control inside of, very small tools that maybe only a few teams use, things like that. The amount of CAB meetings that I've sat in since I've been at CircleCI, 0. And that's why I get to spotlight, because that has a special place in my heart. We still announce significant changes. It doesn't mean that we just kind of abort all communications to other parties. We have a Slack channel that most people sit in that would care about what changes are going on and into the platform. And that includes our support people and our customer engineers and of course, most of engineering. And, we'll say, hey, this is coming. If you see anything, let us know. Or if something goes wrong here, here's why it could be happening. Because not everything has 100% exhaustive test coverage, as we talked about earlier. And sometimes we still guess incorrectly. We guess wrong if it's going to be significant or not. And I don't think that anybody's above that. And I don't want to act like, we're above that, because we're not. We will make a decision every now and then and say, oh, that should be, low impact or no impact. We were wrong. And the last thing is, our engineers still want it all to be better because they think our change control process sucks, which is very much in line with what our overall survey data told us. So, we have decent outcomes. We have quite good outcomes, I would say. We have quite good velocity. We have quite good, kind of what's going on with the change control process, and the engineers still don't like it. So we group right in there with that engineering-led cohort. So overall, what did we learn? Well, the success of DevOps was taking the great parts about software development and applying them to operations, and change management effectiveness is the exact same thing. Automation delivers better outcomes. Approval should be scoped to the appropriate areas. CI has many of the characteristics that lead to the best outcomes in terms of both change and DevOps effectiveness. And I still have a lot of scar tissue from CAB meetings and change management processes that I probably haven't worked out very well with everyone. So there's a couple resources here if you want to learn more, and that's the data from the 2020 State of DevOps report, which is available now on puppet.com. There's also the 2014 State of DevOps report from Puppet, and there's the 2020 State of Software Delivery, which is a data-backed benchmarks for engineering teams at CircleCI.com. That last one has much more kind of, instead of from survey data, it's taken more from the data sets that we see just from people running jobs on CircleCI. It's a larger data set. We can infer some different things from the way that happens kind of in a mechanical way versus in a way that people talk about it. I really encourage you to take a look. And lastly, I'd like to thank Alana, who did a whole lot for Puppet on the marketing and the writing of the State of DevOps reports. And she made this talk better by helping me with some of the graphs, some of the diagrams, and of course, helped write I shouldn't say helped write. I helped her write the 2020 State of DevOps report. She definitely did the vast majority of it. So thanks to Alana. Anyway, I'm Mike Stahnke. I hope you really enjoyed this presentation. If you want to talk to me more, you can find me at Stahnma, primarily on Twitter. You can hit me up on LinkedIn or whatever if you want as well. And thank you for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of the virtual conference here for Puppet. Thanks.